Hey everybody, it's Chainsaw Reacts, and welcome to the 18th episode of the Chainsaw Reacts podcast. As you can tell, guys, by the title of this podcast is dedicated to one man, or should I say, one legend. I will say that throughout this entire podcast, so get used to it. This podcast is dedicated to Sir Christopher Lee, who unfortunately passed away this past Sunday morning, but the news was not made public until Thursday morning, which is completely understandable. The family wanted some privacy and they deserve that. This podcast also, guys, is not, scripted. It is not planned. This is me winging it because I feel in this type of situation where someone of that importance to cinema, someone of that importance to a lot of people's childhood and to a lot of people's love of movies and franchises, it's best to not really script it all out. It's best to just wing it and just give your true feelings and just let it flow. So that's what's going to happen today. The mood, of course, my vibe, my emotion is not happy and everything and energetic. It is kind of down because even though this is being recorded the day after the news was broke publicly, I'm still kind of not necessarily shook because I didn't know him personally, but I'm still kind of in shock that someone of that magnitude, someone who even when he reached the ages of 90 and onwards to 93 when he unfortunately passed away, he was still very active with a lot of things he did. So it's just kind of a shock that it just happened so suddenly. So anyways, let's jump into this thing, guys. So the first thing I'm going to look into is actually reading an article that was written about his death, and then read a couple of the tweets from people that knew him personally, and go from there, essentially, and then getting into his filmography, some of the things I've seen of his film work, and basically talk about all the things that I really liked about the man, and what I really liked about him as a person, not just the characters he played on screen. Christopher Lee, the actor, was often the villain. He played Dracula, the bad guy in the James Bond thriller The Man with the Golden Gun, the deliciously evil wizard Saruman in the Lord of the Rings film, and the dude who fought Yoda with a lightsaber in Star Wars Attack of the Clones. But Sir Christopher Lee, the man, who died this week at the age of 93, not an ounce of villain to be found. Fans and fellow actors alike said Thursday. And before I continue on with the tweets, this really does sum up a lot of his more famous work, of course, him being a Bond villain in a James Bond thriller film, The Man with the Golden Gun. He played Dracula in multiple films, not just one or two, several films he played Dracula. And, of course, he was the awesome Saruman from Lord of the Rings films, and he reprised the role in Hobbit, which we'll get to those things later. And he was not just the dude who fought Yoda. He was Count Dooku. Let's get that straight, people. But they are correct. He was not a villainous person at all. He was a hero, essentially. If you want to go, he was not a villain. He was a hero. So let's stick with that. So this is the most important tweet they put at the top, which makes a lot of sense. Elijah Wood tweeted out saying, "An extraordinary man and life led. Sir Christopher Lee, you were an icon and a towering human being with stories for days. We'll miss you." And that really does sum up him as a person and him as someone that came across to all actors and actresses. I've been reading that throughout this entire ordeal, this whole entire situation where people are tweeting and Facebook and all this type of stuff. I've been reading of with other actors and actresses coming out, tweeting, posting interviews, where they all say basically the same thing Elijah is saying here, that he loved telling stories. He was an extraordinary man. He was nice. He didn't come off as a jerk or anything like that. He was just a genuine nice person. And I also agree with the phrase, "You were an icon." Except I would say he is still a icon. I think forever it will go down in history as one of the one of the best actors we've ever seen of our time, in my personal opinion. He's had so many great roles, not just the most famous ones. He's done a lot of great work that people may not know about. And I hope with this unfortunate tragedy of him losing his life, that people will look into his filmography and look into the lesser known things he did and see what other things he did besides the major blockbusters and all that kind of stuff, you know. As he has a lot of film credits to his name, to be completely honest, and I'll get to those little things in a little bit. Scroll down here to the next tweet, which they have referenced here, from Sir Roger Moore. I'm not really sure who this is, but maybe if I saw a picture, maybe I would know who it is. It's terrible. It's terribly. It's terribly. Okay, that's the English there is a little bit weird, so I'll start all over again. Sir Roger Moore's tweet says, "It's terrible when you lose an old friend. And Christopher Lee was one of my oldest. We first met in 1948, which is the year in 1948 Christopher Lee started in cinema. That was his first role he ever had in a film, was in the year 1948. That is insane. My gosh, he's been at this for a very long time. I'm probably going to mispronounce the last name here. Mark Gatiss, the great, always criminally underrated Sir Christopher Lee has left us. A titan of cinema and a huge part of my youth. Farewell." Now, I will say this, criminally underrated, maybe in the sense of a lot of the work he did that was not considered a franchise, but I would say that people knew of Christopher Lee for the major roles, of course, but I don't think he was considered underrated. He was always praised as being one of the best performances you would see in the Lord of the Rings films, or one of the best things a part of the prequel trilogy of the Star Wars films. A titan of cinema from his tweet, I completely agree. A huge part of my youth, I agree with that as well. And it continues on with other pictures and other things like that. So, with this whole entire news, it seems that, people are starting to realize that there was more to Christopher Lee than just the characters. And I have to agree with that because he did so many other things besides movies and TV. He did a lot of other work of that sort. He actually did music. He actually is a singer, which I was actually very surprised about that because, when you think of a very well trained actor, a very well known actor of that magnitude, you don't expect this actor or actress to have another hobby essentially, or basically be very good at something else. His voice has always been recognizable forever. He has a very unique voice like James Earl Jones or Sean Connery, just a very unique and very strong voice, like Leonard Nimoy as well. And so when he would sing, that vocal power with his speaking voice comes out in a huge way. And I think he's done some classical pieces. I know for a fact, because I've seen him before, he actually has done some metal music records. And I'm actually a fan of metal music myself. And when I heard about this, before his passing, of course, I actually knew about this for quite some time. I thought it was very interesting that he, at that age, in the 80s to even after he passed his age 90, he was still putting out metal albums. It's insane. And so to see his passion in music in his late of age is just very shocking to me because you just don't see people that age getting into music per se in singing, let alone metal music. It's just it just blows my mind each time I think about it that the man who has done so much for one medium, which is cinema, and TV, I guess you could say, considered in the same way because it's watchable essentially, can move over into another medium completely different in the sense of he doesn't go to do classical, he goes over to do metal music. It's just not bizarre, it's just very strange, but it works out for the best because it's still good. It's just like this is the guy, this is the legend I consider on cinema. Now he's singing about Charlemagne, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and singing about all these different things, and he's actually really good at it, and he's in his 90s and still sounds like a beast. So, getting into the cinema thing, I want to look a little bit into some of his filmography, essentially. Now, I did mention before what I want to repeat one more time. His first film he ever did was in 1948. He actually did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I believe 8 films. Yes, 8 films entirely in 1948. 8 films. That is insane, let alone the fact that when you scroll down here at the very bottom, he has been credited as so far to 206 films. And in television, it's not credited because he does certain if he's only did an episode or whatever. But his first film was in 1948, and his last film is in 2015 actually, released at least in 2015. 206 films. His first television performance was in 1955, and his last one was in 2008. Video games, scrolling through here, the first game was in 1994, and then 2015 he was the narrator, the programmer for Deus Ex Machina 2. No idea what game that is, but I'm assuming it's a pretty interesting game if he decided to be the voiceover for the narrator for it. Some of the roles he has none. Obviously, the thing that I read on the CNN page of his passing mentioned a lot of the things he did that was obviously more popularized. But as I was looking through this, I was kind of interested in some of the things he's done that's not been really mentioned. He's on the Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. He played the creature. Let me scroll through this actually because I want to make sure that this is saying that he actually plays. Christopher Lee has played Frankenstein's monster in 1957. That's something I did not know until I started looking through his filmography. Now I know, of course, he's played Dracula. Of course, obviously, several multiple films. The first appearance was in 1958, and he continues on, and he appears again in 1970 again. Even though we skipped a couple of years of films, but in 1970 he comes back and plays it again, and then we can continue scrolling down. I think he stopped playing it at a certain point, actually. Yeah, I think so. At this point, he's done playing Dracula, but he just comes back so many years later after doing multiple films as Count Dracula and does it again. It's pretty insane. Another thing I noticed too is that he actually played Sherlock Holmes in a film in 1962 entitled Sherlock Holmes and the Deadly Necklace. And I never heard about this film until you look up the filmography. You learn things once you start looking into stuff like this. He's also played in the 1959 movie The Mummy. He actually played the mummy in that film, which I had no idea he did that either. So he's played Frankenstein's monster, Dracula in multiple films, and as of right now, as I'm looking, because I did some little bit of looking before I started this podcast, but he's also played the mummy. So he's played three different legendary monsters, essentially: Dracula, the mummy, and Frankenstein's monster. Continue on down here. Let's see. It's just so many roles he plays. I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's a small role or a big role. I mean, he was just so good at what he did. And one thing I knew I was going to say within this podcast, and I guess I'll say it now because, we're kind of at this point talking about his filmography here, is that I believe there are many, many great actors and actresses in Hollywood, in cinema, alive or dead. There has been so many greats. But realistically, there is only really a few legends I consider in cinema. Not including TV, just the films, just movies. And I believe that there's only a select few legends that could ever be put in that category, not because of how many films they have, but because how many times have they performed as different characters and blew it out of the park, destroyed that character in a good way, and basically showed how great of an actor they are. And I believe Christopher Lee, in my personal opinion, is in that category as legend, not because of the fact that, as I mentioned, he has, as of right now, it could be added more, who knows, 206 films he is credited for. That just because he has 206 films does not mean that he is a legend. That just means that he has had 206 films, and at this point he is considered a legend to a lot of people, and including myself, because he's so good at those roles. Not because of how many roles he's had, but because how good he has been at them. So as we continue on down here, there's just a bunch of more things he's done. Let's see. He was actually in Gremlins 2, The New Batch. I had no idea about that either. Not really a fan of the Gremlins, but that was something. He was actually in Police Academy, Mission to Moscow. No idea about that either. Let's see. I mean, even though people can say I might be listing off films that maybe not considered to be the best, but hey. Okay, so here's actually one. I'm actually saying this as a little bit of a side note. Lee considers this to be his favorite role, most significant, in a movie called Jinnah, and he plays Muhammad Ali Jinnah. I believe that's how you pronounce that word. And apparently Lee considered this to be his most significant role, his favorite role to play. That's kind of interesting. I did not notice that the first time around. So so I guess there's that. So I guess from what this is saying, that that his most memorable, most favorite role to do. He's actually in Sleepy Hollow, which was considered to be I think a blockbuster success. He played the Burgomaster. I believe that's how you pronounce that actually. Of course, now let's get to the major stuff. Lord of the Rings, Saruman. Star Wars, Count Dooku. First, let's get to Lord of the Rings because on the list here it's listed first. Lord of the Rings. It took me a long time to see all the Lord of the Rings films. I saw them back in 2014. I saw Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Return of the King, and literally, I think within one each day. I saw one on one day, the next day, the second one, the next day, the third one. And I honestly felt when I watched The Fellowship of the Ring, Saruman was becoming one of my favorite characters because he started off, at first, a decent human being, a decent wizard, and he turns and attacks Gandalf. And at that point, it just made me go, I did not expect that. I have not read the books. I did not see the movies obviously previous before this first time watching it, and way after the fact when they came out. And when Saruman switched, it blew my mind because the way it was portrayed, Saruman he was a good guy. He wasn't going to be doing any, shady situations or shady stuff, and completely blows you away. And I believe in his performance in Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and the extended edition for Return of the King, because I had the extended edition, that I feel that his performance was top notch in every film for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I felt that his performance was one of the best, in my personal opinion. He brought awesome stuff to that character. He brought something special to that character. And I honestly believe when I saw, him in the outfit and the costume and the long beard and all that stuff, I believed he was Saruman. I didn't think it was Christopher Lee that I knew from Star Wars and I knew from this and I knew from that and all this other stuff. That's just Christopher Lee dressed up as a wizard. I believed he was the character. And that's something that a lot of actors can do. I will admit they can make you believe, hey, that's not the actor, that's the character on screen. But when I saw Saruman and performing like he did and doing the things he does in those films, it was scary a lot of the times. Like this is actually a really bad dude, and Gandalf had no idea. And so I felt that that was something special he brought to that character, that you just didn't expect this evil in him, and then it happens, completely flips you, and you go, "Damn, I just didn't expect that at all." His portrayal as Count Dooku. Now, I wish, honestly, that his portrayal of Count Dooku was more played out, essentially, in the films. Not going to get into the television series that is connected, but, just sticking with the films here. I loved Count Dooku, and I'll tell you why. Because Count Dooku, to me, the character was so different than the other Sith Lords we've seen in the Star Wars universe, from episodes 1, 3, 1 to 3, 4, 5, 6. He was different than Darth Vader. His motives were different. He was a Jedi turned Sith Lord. And obviously you can say, well, that's, Anakin. But I believe that Anakin's mindset was that, he turned to the dark side to save Padme. Count Dooku turned. I'm not sure if it's. I'm pretty sure it's been clarified, but it's not really clarified necessarily in the films. But Count Dooku didn't turn to Sith because trying to save a woman. He turned to Sith for a completely different reason. And, what Christopher Lee especially brought to Attack of the Clones, because, spoiler, he was killed off in Revenge of the Sith very early on. But what he brought to the Attack of the Clones was that he is a menacing force, and that he is someone that you should not play with. And he actually went up against Yoda, as it was mentioned in the article. He actually went up against Yoda in a lightsaber fight and was able to escape. Yoda is the most powerful Jedi in the galaxy, and Count Dooku was able to get away and not die, essentially. So, got to give Count Dooku that. So, I mean, with the two major roles that he is known for, besides Dracula, besides the villain in a James Bond film, he plays villains very well. He really does. And that doesn't mean that he's a negative person or a bad person, like it was said in the article. He's not a villain at all. But he plays it so well because he knows not how to be the scariest on screen and and look like he's going to kill somebody, but it's just the little subtle things that he did with Count Dooku and Saruman that made them more menacing and more villainous and more evil looking, just by those subtle little things he did. And I think that's what made him so different than other people that have played villains, because other villains would scream and they would do the most menacing and evil thing to make it look like, this is the most badass thing, a person in this film, this most badass person in the universe and in this world. He didn't have to do that to make those characters seem dark and and make you scared. He didn't have to do those over the top things to make Saruman or Count Dooku scary. The little subtle things and the little things he did to make that character more freaky to audiences is what made it, I think, the best for everybody, I think. That's how I looked at it. I didn't look at Count Dooku as the most scary and, evil because of he was doing all this stuff. I looked at him as a very scary and evil villain because of how he expressed himself, how he said his dialogue in film. And I think that's where it took it to another level for me as viewing him as an actor, because when I viewed these films and I watched them for enjoyment, and do I really believe when these characters are speaking these lines? Do I believe it? Do I actually see this world as being real, and I'm not like thinking, well, I'm taken out of the film because this is kind of when he was on screen and he was giving a line, whether it's 3 words or a huge long paragraph, I believed that he was that character. I didn't believe, like I said before, that he was Christopher Lee. And I think that was the best thing for me. And I grew up on the Star Wars films, the prequels, of course, seen the original 3 several times, of course. And his portrayal as Count Dooku was one that really stood out to me, and I just really wished that they kept him around a little bit longer in Revenge of the Sith. So it happens. Continue on a little bit more here. He actually played Dr. Wilbur Wonka in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Willy and the Wonka and the Chocolate Factory remake, which it was a small role, but he played the dentist father of Willy Wonka, which was kind of interesting. I didn't expect it, but then he just shows up out of nowhere. He was actually the Jabberwocky. He voiced it for a very little short time in the Alice in Wonderland, the live-action version that was directed by Tim Burton. Now, even though it was a very small role, I actually saw the film in theaters. I felt that even though it was a very small role for voicing the Jabberwocky in Alice in Wonderland, was still pretty good in my personal opinion. Pretty good. Now, of course, the Hobbit Trilogy, which he did not show up in the Desolation of Smaug, but he showed up in Unexpected Journey, The First Hobbit, and The Battle of the Five Armies. Now, I was looking into this, and apparently Saruman is actually not in the Hobbit book. I wouldn't know, because I've not read Lord of the Rings or Hobbit. But he shows up in the Hobbit Trilogy, or the first and third film, essentially. He shows up within the trilogy of films, essentially. And thinking that these 3 films, and they had 2, but they split to 3, were filmed at the same time. He must have been in his late 80s, early 90s when he was filming for the first and third film when he showed up in. And it's like, even though I know that in the third film, in the Battle of the Five Armies, when he's fighting, I forget what the ghost figures are called, but when he's fighting them, it's not Christopher Lee. But even though I know that's not him, to think that he was still in his late 80s, early 90s filming these scenes, and he still has it. because it goes to the whole age factor. And I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, you know, at a certain point, your body starts giving up. Usually at 70, especially at 80s, especially 90s, your body just starts giving up. You start losing your mind, you start losing your speech, you start losing your way to walk around. Your body starts failing slowly. And for him, it never seemed that way. Especially when you look at these Hobbit Trilogy films where he shows up in the first and third one. Even though they were filmed quite some time before it was released, the fact that he was still able to do the dialogue and there was no issues, and you can actually watch it behind the scenes when he was filming for the first Hobbit film, An Unexpected Journey. He was telling stories, he had great timing, he was able to keep up with conversations, and he literally, you know, should be in a nursing home. And that's not a negative thing to say about him. I'm saying is for a regular person who is in the late 80s, early 90s, 99% of the time they should be in a nursing home because of their living capabilities. They're not able to live by themselves. They're not able to do anything by themselves. And he was able to do that. And I'm saying is he was one of a very few of that age can still do something, and not only do regular things but act. Remember dialogue, and able to perform and actually make it. He's still holding up against actors and actresses around that time that are years, decades younger than him, and he's still able to hold his own. That is fantastic. That shows that his mind is so strong that he's able to still do the things that he started out doing at a very young age back in 1948, and he's still able to do those things now in the 2000s and 2010s. It just sucks that we lost him. And we all know that the everyone dies at some point. Everyone dies. But you just don't expect it. You just don't expect it sometimes. You just don't. And some people have said it's not really a negative thing, but I do want to address this real fast before I kind of wind down the podcast here. I've been reading online that some people said that, this is not really a shocking news because his age. He was 93. I get that. There is legitimate, talks about that because at that age, it's literally, you just don't know what's going to happen. You really have no idea. And I think the reason why it was still shocking to everybody, not because the general thing is because he was in these major franchises and he was part of people's childhoods and he was just a fantastic actor, a legend, as I have said several times throughout this podcast. It's because he was still doing these things up to his point of his death. It's not like he retired back in 2004 or 2011 or something, and then a couple years after the fact he passed away. It's the fact that he was still doing these things at that age. That's the biggest thing. I remember a couple of months ago, actually, guys, that I was actually thinking about this. The guy is like 92, and he's still doing these things. And then as we know, he passed away. And so it's crazy. A couple months ago, I was thinking like he's still 92 and doing these things. He's amazing. He really is. This news really crushed me. It really did. I mean, not just because the fact that he was so good at what he did for movies, the fact that everything he did was something good, something special. I'm kind of lost at words because I don't know how else to express my thoughts about this except that Sir Christopher Lee is a legend. He is someone who I think will go down in the history books as one of the best we've ever seen on screen. One of the best we've ever seen in movies. He was so good at portraying characters and so good at portraying different types of characters that you don't believe that he's kind of taking a little bit from this character and using it for this one. He was so good at making them unique and make them stand out. He was so good at making you believe every character he portrayed. And we're never going to see another Sir Christopher Lee, or just Christopher Lee at that matter. We're never going to see another one like him. We're not. We might see somebody who portrays, you know, different characters up to 150 films. We might see someone who does 250 films. So he just does like 10 films a year or something. We see somebody like that. We might. But just because you do a lot of films doesn't mean that you're great or you're a legend. It's what you do with those films is what makes you a legend. It's what you do with them is what makes you stand out. And what Christopher Lee has done, which I'll repeat it once more, has made all those characters and all those things he's done stand out in a big way. And I'm hoping that this honoring and these tributes continue to happen for a little bit for Christopher Lee, because I believe he deserved it. And I hope that with all this, that people will start looking into his filmography, his discography, his voiceover work, whatever he's done, and look into the things he's done that's kind of behind the scenes, kind of the stuff you just don't see out in the open because it's not really popular, and discover new things that he did. I think that will be the best thing. So that is the podcast, guys. That is my thoughts. That is my kind of winging of the legendary Christopher Lee. I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. What are your thoughts about Christopher Lee? What was your favorite role he's ever played in? Let me know in the comment section below. And are you guys gonna be looking into films he's done that are less known, or are you just gonna be, just looking at rewatching films you know him best from? Thank you guys for listening to the podcast. I hope to see you guys soon.